The morning of September 3rd, 2011, broke perfect over Lake Crescent. The kind of morning that makes you understand why people move to the Olympic Peninsula, why they trade city conveniences for this raw beauty. Crystal clear water reflecting the mountains. Morning mist clinging to the Douglas firs. The lake so still it looked like polished glass. Mark Stevens stood at the boat launch at Storm King Ranger Station, checking his gear one last time. Life jacket, paddle, waterproof bag with his phone and wallet, water bottle, emergency whistle. He'd done this routine 100 times, maybe more. Lake Crescent was his sanctuary, his church, his therapist. Every Saturday morning when weather permitted, Mark would launch his yellow kayak and paddle out into the pristine waters. The lake is deep, officially 624 feet at its deepest point, though locals will tell you nobody really knows how deep it goes. The water stays cold year-round, fed by mountain snowmelt. So cold it doesn't support the bacteria that causes decomposition. So cold that things that sink to the bottom tend to stay there. Preserved, hidden. Mark pushed off from the dock at 6:47 a.m. A fisherman named Dale Morrison was just arriving, saw him paddle out. They exchanged waves. Dale would later tell investigators it was a perfect morning. No wind, no chop. Ideal conditions. He watched Mark's yellow kayak grow smaller as he headed toward the center of the lake, then turned his attention to rigging his fishing line. That was the last confirmed sighting of Mark Stevens alive. By noon, Mark's wife Jennifer was concerned. He was always home by 11 on his Saturday paddles. Always. He'd shower, they'd have lunch, maybe drive into Port Angeles for errands. It was their routine. She called his cell, straight to voicemail. She told herself not to worry. Maybe he'd stopped to talk to someone. Maybe he was taking photos. Mark loved photographing the lake, had hundreds of shots on his computer. Different lights, different seasons, different moods. By 2 p.m., concern had shifted to worry. Jennifer drove to the boat launch. Mark's truck was still in the parking lot. His kayak wasn't at the shore. She scanned the lake, that massive expanse of blue surrounded by mountains. Nothing. No flash of yellow anywhere. By 3 p.m., she'd called 911. The Clallam County Sheriff's Marine Unit launched their search boats within the hour. 2 vessels equipped with sonar, searchlights, emergency equipment. They started at the boat launch and worked outward in expanding circles. Standard search pattern. They were looking for a yellow kayak. Bright, distinctive, should be easy to spot. As the sun began dropping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the water, they found it. Mark's kayak, floating upside down near Barnes Point, almost 2 miles from where he'd launched. His paddle floating nearby. His life jacket still secured to the deck with bungee cords, unused. The water temperature that day was 46 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, hypothermia sets in within minutes. Unconsciousness within 15 to 30 minutes. Without a life jacket, in water that cold, survival time is measured in minutes, not hours. The search continued until dark, resumed at first light. Dive teams arrived from Seattle. The Coast Guard brought in helicopters. For 3 days, they searched. Boats with sonar swept back and forth across the lake. Divers descended as deep as safely possible. Dogs trained to detect human remains worked the shoreline. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign of Mark Stevens except his empty kayak and unused life jacket. Lake Crescent had claimed another victim, and as it had done before, it wasn't giving anything back. The sheriff's office classified it as a presumed drowning. Accidental? Tragic, but not uncommon. Every year, someone underestimates the lake. Every year, the cold water claims lives. Mark Stevens became a statistic, a cautionary tale, a reminder to always wear your life jacket. But Jennifer Stevens never believed it was an accident. Neither did a handful of others who knew Mark well. Because Mark Stevens wasn't just any kayaker. He was an expert, certified instructor, who taught kayak safety courses for the Olympic Peninsula Paddlers Club. A man who preached life jacket use with religious fervor. A man who'd paddled Lake Crescent in far worse conditions than that perfect September morning. Something else happened out there on the lake. Something that took an experienced kayaker from his boat on a calm morning. Something that left no trace except questions that would haunt this small community for the next 13 years. Mark Stevens was 44 years old when he disappeared. He'd lived on the Olympic Peninsula for 12 years, moving from Seattle in 1999 after burning out on the tech industry. He'd made a fortune during the first dot-com boom, cashed out before the crash, and decided to find something real. That's how he described it to friends. I want something real. He found it in the peninsula's ancient forests, its wild coastline, its mountain lakes. He bought a house in Port Angeles with a view of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. He married Jennifer, a local teacher he met at a bookstore. They didn't have kids, said they were happy with just each other and their 2 dogs. Mark did consulting work remotely, enough to pay the bills without consuming his life. He volunteered with environmental groups, taught kayaking, served on the local water safety board. He was known. That's important to understand. In a community like Port Angeles, population 20,000, people know each other. Mark wasn't some tourist who'd rented a kayak on vacation. He was a local, respected, liked by most who knew him. He had routines, patterns, connections, which is why his disappearance hit differently. When a stranger drowns in Lake Crescent, it's sad but distant. When Mark Stevens vanished, it was personal. People knew Jennifer. They'd taken Mark's kayaking classes. They'd seen him at the farmer's market, at city council meetings, at the local coffee shop that he treated like his office. The initial investigation was thorough within its scope. The sheriff's office interviewed everyone who'd been at the lake that morning. Dale Morrison, the fisherman, a couple camping at the Storm King site, 2 hikers who'd started up the Mary Mere Falls Trail around 7 a.m. Nobody saw anything unusual. Nobody heard anything. No cries for help, no sounds of distress. They examined Mark's truck. Nothing unusual. Keys in the ignition, wallet in the glove compartment, like always. They checked his phone records. No calls that morning, no texts. The last activity was checking weather conditions at 5:45 a.m. They inspected the kayak for damage. None found, no punctures, no cracks, no signs of collision. The paddle was intact. All safety equipment accounted for, except Mark himself. The medical examiner reviewed Mark's records. No health conditions that might cause sudden incapacitation. No medications. No history of seizures or heart problems. His last physical showed a healthy 44-year-old man who exercised regularly. Without a body, without evidence of foul play, without any indication of what had happened, the investigation stalled. The file stayed open technically, but active investigation ceased after 2 weeks. Mark Stevens was presumed drowned. Case closed, except it never really closes when there's no body. There's no funeral with a casket, no grave to visit, just absence and questions. Jennifer held a memorial service a month later. The Episcopal Church was packed. People shared stories about Mark, his passion for conservation, his patience as a teacher, his awful jokes that he'd repeat until you laughed just to make him stop. They played his favorite music, displayed his photographs of Lake Crescent. Ironic, everyone thought, that the lake he loved had taken him. But Jennifer couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Mark was beyond careful on the water. He'd literally written safety protocols for the paddling club. He'd rescued other kayakers who'd gotten into trouble. The man who'd drilled into hundreds of students to always wear their life jacket wouldn't have left his secured to the deck. She hired a private investigator with some of Mark's life insurance money. Tom Briggs, retired Seattle PD, specialized in cold cases. He spent 3 months investigating, interviewed everyone again, examined every detail. His conclusion frustrated Jennifer more than helped. He couldn't prove it wasn't an accident, but he agreed something felt off. The unused life jacket bothered him. The perfect conditions bothered him. The complete absence of any physical evidence bothered him. Sometimes, he told Jennifer, the perfect crime looks exactly like an accident. But who would want to kill Mark? He had no enemies that anyone knew of. No business disputes, no affairs, no gambling debts, no secret life that anyone could uncover. He was exactly who he appeared to be, a semi-retired tech guy who loved nature and taught kayaking. Jennifer eventually moved back to Tacoma to live with her sister. She couldn't stay in Port Angeles, couldn't drive past the lake, couldn't see Mark's empty kayak hanging in the garage. But she never stopped believing someone had murdered her husband. She called the sheriff's office every September 3rd, asking if there were any new leads. The answer was always the same. No, the case file gathered dust. New mysteries replaced old ones. Mark Stevens became a cautionary tale about water safety, a reminder that Lake Crescent was beautiful but deadly. Most people accepted the official story. Experienced outdoorsmen sometimes make fatal mistakes. Overconfidence kills. Accidents happen. But a few people remembered the questions that were never answered. Why was his life jacket unused? How did he end up so far from his launch point? What could have separated an expert kayaker from his boat on a calm morning? Those questions would wait 13 years for answers. And when those answers finally came, they would shock everyone who thought they knew what happened on Lake Crescent that September morning. The Olympic Peninsula is a world apart from the rest of Washington state, isolated by water and mountains. It developed its own culture, its own pace, its own way of handling things. Port Angeles, the largest city on the northern peninsula, sits between the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the Olympic Mountains. It's a place where everyone knows everyone, where secrets are hard to keep, where grudges can simmer for decades. In 2011, the peninsula was still recovering from the economic devastation of the timber industry's decline. The spotted owl controversy of the 1990s had shut down much of the logging. Mills closed. Families that had logged for generations found themselves without work. The economy was transitioning to tourism and retirees, but slowly, painfully. This economic shift created tension. Old-timers resented the environmentalists they blamed for killing logging. Newcomers like Mark, with their Seattle money and environmental activism, weren't always welcome. Most kept their resentments civil, confined to grumbling at the bar or letters to the Peninsula Daily News. But sometimes those resentments ran deeper. Mark had made enemies, though Jennifer didn't know it at the time. His environmental work had stepped on toes. He'd testified against a proposed development near Lake Crescent that would have brought jobs, but might have impacted water quality. He'd supported stricter regulations on motorboats. He'd pushed for more wilderness protection that some saw as locking up land that could be used productively. None of this seemed like murder motive material. But in a small community where economic survival is precarious, where families have lived for generations, where change is viewed with suspicion, seemingly small conflicts can fester. The sheriff's office in 2011 was understaffed, underfunded, overwhelmed. Clallam County covers 1,700 square miles with a population of 75,000. The department had maybe 30 deputies to patrol all of it. They dealt with meth labs in the forests, domestic violence exacerbated by poverty, theft, drunk driving, the occasional tourist emergency. A drowning that looked like a drowning, even a suspicious one, didn't get the resources it might have received in Seattle or Tacoma. Detective John Walsh was the only investigator assigned to Mark's case full-time, and only for the first 2 weeks. Walsh was thorough but overwhelmed. He had 3 other active cases, including a string of burglaries and a child abuse investigation. He did what he could with the time he had. Walsh interviewed 47 people, friends, family, anyone who'd interacted with Mark in the weeks before his disappearance. He found no red flags. Mark and Jennifer's marriage seemed solid. No financial problems, no threats, no unusual behavior. Mark had seemed normal, happy even, in the days before he disappeared. But Walsh made a note in his file that would prove important years later. 3 people independently mentioned seeing Mark in what appeared to be an argument with someone at the Port Angeles Farmers Market the weekend before he disappeared. None of them could identify the other person clearly. A man, middle-aged, baseball cap, average height. The description could have fit half the men in Clallam County. The argument hadn't seemed serious enough for anyone to intervene. Raised voices, but not shouting. Animated gestures, but not threatening. The kind of disagreement you might see any Saturday at any farmer's market. Nobody thought much of it until Mark disappeared a week later. Walsh tried to identify the man Mark had argued with. He showed photos of Mark to vendors at the market. A few remembered seeing him but couldn't recall who he'd been talking to. The market didn't have security cameras. Neither did most businesses in Port Angeles in 2011. The trail went cold. By the time Walsh's 2 weeks were up, he had a file full of interviews that led nowhere, forensic evidence that showed nothing, and a strong suspicion that he was missing something important. But without bodies, without witnesses, without evidence, suspicion doesn't make a case. The file went to cold cases. Walsh moved on to other investigations. Life in Port Angeles continued. The tourist season ended. Winter rains began. Lake Crescent returned to its quiet state, keeping its secrets below 624 feet of cold, dark water. Before we continue with what happened next, I want to know, have you ever been somewhere that felt like it was hiding something? A place that seemed peaceful on the surface, but gave you an uneasy feeling? Drop a comment and tell me about it. And if you're watching this late at night, like I was when I first researched this case, let me know what time it is where you are. There's something about these stories that draws us in during those quiet, dark hours, isn't there? Also, if you're finding this case as fascinating as I did, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These stories need to be told, and your support helps me bring them to light. Years passed. 2012, 2013, 2014. Jennifer remarried, though she kept Mark's last name professionally. She moved to Portland, started over, but she never stopped calling the sheriff's office every September 3rd, the anniversary, the day Mark disappeared. The calls became shorter over the years. Any new information? No, ma'am. I'm sorry. Thank you. Technology was advancing rapidly. DNA analysis was becoming more sophisticated. Digital forensics were revolutionizing investigations. Databases were connecting dots that couldn't be connected before. Cold cases across the country were being solved with these new tools. In 2018, the Clallam County Sheriff's Office received a grant to review cold cases using new technology. It wasn't much money, but enough to take fresh looks at a handful of unsolved cases. Mark Stevens's file was included, more because it was still technically open than because anyone thought it would yield results. Detective Sarah Chen was assigned to the cold case unit. She was new to Clallam County, transferred from Tacoma, bringing big city investigation experience to the understaffed department. She approached each cold case methodically, starting from scratch, assuming nothing. When she opened Mark's file, she saw what Walsh had seen: a probable drowning with some unusual elements. But Chen had something Walsh didn't have in 2011: advanced digital forensic tools and access to expanded databases. She started with Mark's digital footprint. In 2011, investigators had checked his phone and computer cursorily. Chen did a deep dive. She reconstructed his email history, his social media, limited but present, his web browsing. She found something interesting. In the weeks before his disappearance, Mark had been researching someone. Multiple searches for the name Brian Donnelly. LinkedIn profiles viewed. Public records searched. Property records accessed. Mark had been investigating Brian Donnelly intensively, but carefully, using private browsing modes, deleting histories, but not thoroughly enough to fool modern forensic recovery. Who was Brian Donnelly? Chen discovered he was a local contractor who'd lived in Port Angeles since the 1970s. He'd bid on several projects that Mark's environmental group had opposed. He'd lost contracts because of environmental impact reviews that Mark had pushed for. He'd been vocal in his opposition to outsiders interfering with local business. More interesting, Brian Donnelly owned a boat, a small fishing boat he kept at a marina on Lake Crescent, about 3 miles from where Mark had launched his kayak. Chen pulled marina records from 2011. They showed Donnelly's boat had been taken out early on, September 3rd, and returned that afternoon. He'd told the marina operator he'd been fishing on the west end of the lake, but the west end was the opposite direction from where Mark's kayak was found. This was circumstantial, barely worth noting, except for one thing Chen discovered next. Brian Donnelly had been interviewed after Mark's disappearance, part of Walsh's canvass of local boat owners. He'd told Walsh he hadn't been on the lake that day, a clear lie. Chen dug deeper. She found that Donnelly had filed for bankruptcy in 2010, largely due to lost contracts he blamed on environmental regulations. She found letters to the editor he'd written, railing against environmental extremists and Seattle transplants ruining the peninsula's economy. Mark wasn't mentioned by name, but the timing and context suggested he was a target of Donnelly's anger. She also discovered something Walsh's investigation had missed. That argument at the farmer's market? Chen showed Donnelly's photo to longtime vendors. 2 remembered him as a regular customer who often complained loudly about politics and environmentalists. 1 thought, though couldn't be certain, that Donnelly might have been the man arguing with Mark. Chen needed more. She re-examined the physical evidence. Mark's kayak had been stored in a police warehouse for 13 years. She had it processed with technology that didn't exist in 2011. Microscopic analysis, chemical testing, DNA swabbing of surfaces that might have been touched. They found something. A partial fingerprint on the underside of the kayak, preserved by the cold water, in a location that suggested someone had grabbed or pushed the kayak from below. The print didn't match Mark's. Running it through modern databases got no hits, but Chen had a suspect now. She obtained a warrant for Donnelly's fingerprints under the pretense of a different investigation. When the prints came back, she held her breath as the technician ran the comparison. Match. Brian Donnelly's fingerprint was on Mark Stevens' kayak. A kayak Donnelly had no legitimate reason to have touched. A print in a location consistent with someone in the water grabbing the boat. But 13 years later, a single fingerprint wasn't enough for an arrest. Chen needed more. She needed someone to talk. She started re-interviewing everyone connected to the case, armed with new information, applying pressure where she could. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Donnelly's ex-wife, Patricia, divorced since 2015, living in Sequim. Chen approached her carefully, not revealing what she knew, just asking about Brian's activities in September 2011. Patricia was bitter about the divorce, angry about unpaid alimony. And after a few meetings, she revealed something crucial. Brian had come home wet the morning of September 3, 2011. She remembered specifically because it was unusual. He'd said he'd fallen in the lake trying to net a fish. She'd believed him then. Now, talking to Chen, she wondered. More importantly, Patricia revealed that Brian had been obsessed with Mark Stevens. He'd blamed Mark personally for his business failures. He'd spent hours ranting about him, about how Mark was destroying the peninsula, about how someone needed to stop him. She'd thought it was just talk. Men complaining at home about things they'd never act on. The night before Mark disappeared, Brian had been drinking heavily. She remembered because he'd kept her up, pacing, muttering about settling things, and taking back what's ours. She'd thought he was talking about the economy, about work. Now she wasn't sure. Chen had enough for a warrant. On January 15, 2024, she arrested Brian Donnelly for the murder of Mark Stevens. The arrest shocked Port Angeles. Donnelly was known, but not well liked, a bitter man who complained constantly, but was seen as harmless. The guy who wrote angry letters to the editor. The contractor who'd never adapted to changing times. Nobody thought he was capable of murder. But Chen's investigation revealed a different Brian Donnelly, a man whose rage had been building for years, who'd lost everything he'd worked for and blamed people like Mark, who'd spent months planning what he probably convinced himself was justified revenge against someone he saw as an enemy of his way of life. The investigation revealed the probable sequence of events. Donnelly had taken his boat out early that morning, knowing Mark's routine, knowing he kayaked every Saturday. He'd waited until Mark was far from shore, then approached. Maybe he'd intended just to confront him. Maybe it was always meant to end in violence. The forensic evidence suggested Donnelly had rammed Mark's kayak with his boat, flipping it. In the 46-degree water, Mark would have gone into immediate cold shock. Donnelly had grabbed the kayak, holding it out of Mark's reach. Without his boat, without his life jacket, in water that cold, Mark wouldn't have lasted long. It would have looked like an accident to anyone who discovered the scene later. An overturned kayak, a missing kayaker, a tragic drowning in a lake known for claiming lives. Donnelly had returned to the marina, told the operator he'd been fishing the West End, and gone home to his wife, wet from lake water, but with a story about netting a fish. For 13 years, he'd lived with it. His business never recovered. His marriage fell apart. He'd gained nothing from Mark's death, except the satisfaction of revenge, if you could call it satisfaction. He'd destroyed a life and corrupted his own in the process. The trial was set for September 2024. Donnelly's defense attorney would argue the evidence was circumstantial. A fingerprint could have been transferred. Being on the lake wasn't a crime. An ex-wife's testimony was unreliable. But Chen had built a strong case, brick by brick, detail by detail. Jennifer Stevens, now Jennifer Patterson, flew in from Portland for the trial. She'd waited 13 years for answers. 13 years of believing her husband had been murdered. 13 years of being told she was in denial about a simple drowning. She'd been right all along, though being right brought no satisfaction. Mark was still gone. If you're still with me, you know this case is far from simple. That's why these stories matter. They remind us that justice sometimes takes years, even decades, but it's worth pursuing. If this story resonated with you, please share it. The more people who hear about cases like Mark's, the more pressure there is to solve the ones still waiting for answers. Quick question: what detail from this case surprised you the most? Was it the fingerprint surviving 13 years in cold water? The ex-wife's testimony? Or something else? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. The arrest of Brian Donnelly sent shockwaves through Port Angeles and the broader Olympic Peninsula community. This wasn't a stranger crime or a random act of violence. This was neighbor against neighbor. A local contractor killing an environmental activist. A story that exposed the deep tensions running through the community. The Peninsula Daily News ran the story on the front page. Local man arrested in 2011 Lake Crescent death. Comment sections exploded, social media divided into camps. Some expressed shock that Donnelly was capable of murder. Others said they weren't surprised, that his anger had been visible for years. A darker conversation emerged too. Some defended Donnelly, not his alleged actions, but his frustrations. Comments like Mark Stevens destroyed livelihoods and environmentalists pushed people too far appeared online. Others pushed back hard, arguing that economic frustration never justified violence, that Mark had been exercising his civic rights. The case reopened old wounds about the timber wars, about the economy, about change and resistance to change. It forced the community to confront questions they'd rather avoid. How much resentment was still simmering? How many other conflicts were one bad day from violence? Local environmental groups held vigils for Mark. They praised his work, his dedication to protecting the peninsula's natural resources. They also expressed fear. If Mark could be killed for his activism, were others at risk? Several activists reported receiving threatening messages after Donnelly's arrest, anonymous notes suggesting Mark got what he deserved. The kayaking community was devastated. Mark had been one of their most respected members. The Olympic Peninsula Paddlers Club held a memorial paddle on Lake Crescent, dozens of kayakers forming a circle where Mark had likely died. They wore life jackets. Mark would have insisted on that. But the most profound impact was on those who'd accepted the drowning narrative. People who'd used Mark's death as a cautionary tale about water safety had to reckon with the fact that he'd been murdered. The lake hadn't claimed him through carelessness. Human violence had. Search and rescue volunteers who'd looked for Mark's body struggled with the revelation. They'd spent days searching for what they thought was a drowning victim. Now they knew they'd been searching for a murder victim. Some wondered if they'd missed something, some clue that could have pointed to foul play. Detective Walsh, the original investigator, was retired but following the case closely. He felt both vindicated and frustrated. He'd suspected something was off but hadn't found the evidence. He wondered what he'd missed, whether better resources or more time might have solved it in 2011. The marina operator who'd logged Donnelly's boat that day was haunted. He'd provided an alibi without knowing it. If he'd been more observant, asked more questions, could Mark's death have been solved sooner? Rationally, he knew he couldn't have known. But guilt doesn't always listen to logic. Brian Donnelly's family was destroyed by the arrest. His adult children, who'd grown up in Port Angeles, faced harassment and threats. His son moved to Idaho. His daughter changed her last name. They'd lost their father to prison and their place in the community to his crime. Patricia Donnelly, the ex-wife whose testimony had been crucial, received both praise and condemnation. Some called her brave for speaking up. Others called her a traitor for testifying against her ex-husband. She left the peninsula, unable to bear the attention and judgment. The economic tensions Donnelly represented didn't disappear with his arrest. If anything, they intensified. Town meetings became more contentious. Environmental proposals faced more aggressive opposition. Some feared Donnelly's actions would inspire others. Others hoped it would serve as a warning about where extremism leads. The case also sparked a broader conversation about cold cases on the peninsula. How many other deaths had been misclassified? How many accidents weren't accidents? Families of other victims began pushing for their cases to be reviewed with new technology. The Washington State Attorney General's office announced funding for cold case reviews statewide. Mark's case had demonstrated that with new technology and dedicated investigation, old mysteries could be solved. But it also highlighted how many cases had been closed prematurely, how many families were still waiting for answers. For Jennifer, the arrest brought complicated emotions. Relief that she'd been right. Rage at Donnelly for taking Mark. Frustration at the system that had dismissed her concerns for 13 years. Grief, fresh and raw, as she had to relive Mark's death through the legal process. She filed a civil suit against Donnelly, though he had few assets left. It wasn't about money. It was about accountability, about making sure the full story was told. She also established a foundation in Mark's name, supporting both environmental protection and cold case investigations. The trial began on September 3, 2024, exactly 13 years after Mark's death. The courtroom was packed. Media from Seattle and beyond covered it. The Olympic Peninsula watched as one of its own was tried for a murder that had been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. Prosecutor Linda Martinez laid out the case methodically, the fingerprint evidence, the marina records proving Donnelly had lied, Patricia's testimony about his obsession with Mark, his wet clothes, his threats, the digital evidence showing Mark had been investigating Donnelly before his death. The defense, led by attorney Robert Carlson, attacked each point. The fingerprint could have been transferred. Marina records weren't precise. An ex-wife's testimony was biased. Digital searches proved nothing. They painted Donnelly as a scapegoat, a bitter man being blamed for a tragic accident because the community needed someone to punish. The key moment came when Donnelly himself testified. Against his attorney's advice, he insisted on taking the stand. He started controlled, denying everything, claiming he'd never touched Mark's kayak, never saw him that morning. But under cross-examination, his composure cracked. Martinez pressed him about his bankruptcy, about the contracts lost to environmental reviews, about his letters to the editor. Donnelly's anger, suppressed for 13 years, erupted. He ranted about environmentalists destroying the peninsula, about outsiders like Mark taking away livelihoods, about justice and revenge. He stopped just short of confessing, but the jury saw what he was. A man consumed by rage, capable of violence, who'd harbored a specific grudge against the victim. Combined with the physical evidence, it was enough. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On September 5th, they returned a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Donnelly, now 67, was sentenced to 25 years to life. Given his age, it was effectively a life sentence. As Donnelly was led away, he turned to Jennifer in the gallery. "He destroyed everything I worked for," he said. Jennifer's response was quiet, but carried through the silent courtroom. "You destroyed everything he was." The conviction brought legal closure, but opened deeper questions. How many Brian Donnellys were out there? How many conflicts were simmering beneath the surface of small communities? How many accidents weren't accidents at all? Detective Chen received commendations for solving the case. She continued working cold cases, applying the same methodical approach, the same new technologies. She solved 2 more cases in the next year, both deaths that had been ruled accidents or suicides, but were actually homicides. Lake Crescent remains beautiful and dangerous. People still kayak its waters, though perhaps with more caution. The lake still keeps secrets, bodies from decades past that have never surfaced. But it kept one less secret after Chen's investigation. Mark Stevens was more than a cautionary tale or a cold case. He was a man who loved the natural world and fought to protect it. He was a husband who was deeply loved. He was a teacher who shared his passion with others. He was a community member who engaged in democracy even when it made him enemies. His death wasn't random or senseless. It was the result of tensions that exist in communities across America. Economic anxiety versus environmental protection. Old ways versus new. Local versus outsider. These tensions don't usually lead to violence, but Mark's case shows they can. The Olympic Peninsula is still processing what happened. The economy is still transitioning. Environmental debates still rage. But maybe there's more awareness now of where rhetoric can lead, of how resentment can fester, of why it's crucial to address conflicts before they explode. The Stevens Foundation has funded 3 cold case investigations so far. 2 have been solved. Jennifer remains involved, pushing for better resources, for cold cases, for taking families' concerns seriously, for recognizing that sometimes intuition is right, even when evidence is lacking. Every September 3rd, kayakers gather on Lake Crescent for a memorial paddle. They wear life jackets and bright colors. They paddle to where Mark likely died and form a circle on the water. They share stories, memories, lessons. Then they paddle back to shore, safe, together, remembering. The case of Mark Stevens reminds us that justice delayed isn't always justice denied, that technology advances, that determined investigators can solve decades-old cases, that the truth, even when buried beneath years of lies and assumptions, has a way of surfacing. It reminds us, too, that every cold case represents a person, someone who was loved, someone whose absence left a hole that never quite heals, someone who deserves to have their story told truthfully, completely, finally. If this story moved you, please share it. Every share helps more people learn about cases like Mark's, puts pressure on authorities to reinvestigate cold cases, and reminds us why we can't give up on finding the truth. What cold case haunts your community? Drop it in the comments. Maybe sharing these stories, keeping these names alive, is one small way we can push for the justice that every victim deserves. And remember to subscribe and hit that notification bell. There are more cases to explore, more truths to uncover, more stories that need to be told. Mark Stevens died on September 3rd, 2011. He was 44 years old. He spent his life protecting the waters that would ultimately become the scene of his death. He fought for environmental preservation, for responsible development, for a sustainable future. Those fights made him enemies, and one of those enemies killed him. For 13 years, his death was misunderstood as an accident. His killer lived free while his family lived with questions. But determination, technology, and detective work finally revealed the truth. Brian Donnelly was convicted of murder. Justice was served, even if it couldn't undo the damage done. Mark's legacy lives on in the protected lands he fought for, in the students he taught to paddle safely, in the foundation bearing his name, and in the proof that cold cases can be solved. His story reminds us that the truth matters, that justice matters, and that sometimes, even after more than a decade, both can still be found. The waters of Lake Crescent still run deep and cold. They still hold secrets, but they no longer hold the secret of what happened to Mark Stevens. That truth, finally, has surfaced. Rest in peace, Mark. Your story has been told. Your death has been solved. Your life mattered then, and it matters still.